Maggie, stop! What on earth has gotten into you? Sarah Parker barely managed to stay on her feet as her German shepherd, Maggie, yanked her forward with unexpected force. One moment, they were enjoying their usual evening walk along the familiar trail behind their house, the crisp autumn air filling Sarah's lungs. The next, Maggie was pulling her toward the thick forest off the path, her powerful body tensed with urgency. Sarah had never seen her dog act like this. Maggie was well-trained, obedient, and gentle, but now she was behaving as if she were on a mission. Her ears were perked, her tail rigid, and her entire body strained forward like she had no choice but to follow whatever scent she'd picked up. Sarah's heart pounded as she struggled to regain control, but Maggie was determined. The leash tightened in Sarah's grip, and for a brief moment she debated letting go before finally giving in and allowing her companion to lead the way. The path disappeared as they moved deeper into the woods. Fallen leaves crunched beneath Sarah's boots, the dimming light casting eerie shadows through the trees. Sarah's breath came quicker, but Maggie's never faltered. She had locked onto something, and Sarah had no choice but to follow. Then, suddenly, the forest opened up to a small clearing, and Maggie came to an abrupt halt. Sarah nearly toppled over from the momentum. The silence was almost deafening, but it was quickly broken by a faint, muffled sound. A whimper. A cry. It was hard to tell. Sarah's gaze swept the area, heart hammering. Then she saw it. A small form, barely visible in the fading light, huddled against the roots of an old oak tree. Sarah's stomach clenched as she took a step closer. It was a child. A little boy, no older than 5, curled up and shivering. "Oh my goodness," Sarah gasped, rushing forward. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" The boy flinched at the sound of her voice, his wide blue eyes filled with fear. He was covered in dirt, his clothes torn and stained, his tiny hands clutching his knees as though making himself as small as possible. Maggie whined and took a slow, cautious step forward, lowering her head in an attempt to appear non-threatening. The boy hesitated but reached out his trembling fingers, touching the soft fur on Maggie's nose. "It's okay," Sarah whispered, dropping to her knees. "You're safe now. What's your name, honey?" The boy opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips moved slightly, but he only shook his head. He was either too frightened or too weak to speak. Sarah's mind raced. How had he gotten here? Was he lost? Had someone left him? There was no sign of anyone else around. Her stomach churned at the possibilities. "Come on, let's get you out of here," she said gently, removing her jacket and wrapping it around the boy's small frame. He didn't resist, only clutching the fabric as though it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "My name is Sarah. This is Maggie. She's a good girl, and she'll protect you." Maggie seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, staying close as Sarah lifted the child into her arms. He was lighter than she expected, and her heart squeezed at the thought of how long he'd been out here alone. The journey back to the trail was slow. Darkness was falling rapidly, and Sarah's thoughts ran wild. She needed to call the authorities, but her phone was back at home. The nearest house was a good 10-minute walk away. She'd have to carry the boy the whole way. Maggie trotted ahead, ears flicking at every sound. Sarah had never felt so grateful for her dog's instincts. If Maggie hadn't pulled her off the trail, she never would have found this child. Finally, the trees thinned, and the familiar sight of her house came into view. Relief washed over her. She hurried onto her porch, shifting the boy in her arms as she fumbled with the door handle. Once inside, she set him down gently on the couch. "You're safe now," she reassured him before rushing to grab her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I just found a little boy in the woods, Sarah said quickly. He's alone. He looks scared, and I have no idea where he came from. I live on the outskirts of town near Ridgewood Trail. Please, you have to send someone. Stay on the line, the dispatcher said calmly. Can you describe the child? Sarah glanced at him. He was still curled up on her couch, his big eyes darting between her and Maggie. He's about 5 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, very thin. He won't speak. I think he's in shock. We're sending officers and paramedics your way now. Stay with him and keep him warm. Sarah hung up, exhaling shakily. She turned back to the boy and smiled softly. Help is coming, sweetheart. You're going to be okay. Maggie hopped onto the couch, lying down next to the child. He didn't move away. In fact, he leaned against her, gripping her fur as if she were his lifeline. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. Whatever this boy had been through, he was safe now, and Maggie had made sure of that. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the windows. Sarah hurried to open the door as 2 officers and a paramedic stepped inside. She quickly explained everything she knew, which wasn't much. The paramedic crouched in front of the boy. Hey there, buddy. My name's Mike. We're gonna take care of you, okay? Can I check to make sure you're all right? The boy hesitated, but nodded slightly. As the paramedic worked, one of the officers turned to Sarah. You said you found him in the woods. Was there any sign of anyone else? No, she said. He was all alone. If Maggie hadn't found him, I don't know what would have happened. The officer nodded grimly. We'll have to look into this. Thank you for calling us. Sarah glanced at Maggie, who was watching everything with quiet focus. She reached out and scratched behind her ears. I think Maggie's the real hero here. The officer smiled. Looks like you've got yourself one incredible dog. Sarah couldn't argue with that. But as she looked at the little boy clinging to Maggie, a feeling settled deep in her chest. Something told her this was only the beginning. Sarah watched as the paramedics carefully checked the little boy, their hands gentle as they examined his frail frame. The boy remained silent, his gaze flicking between the officers and Maggie, his small fingers still tangled in the dog's thick fur. Sarah's heart ached for him. He was so young, so fragile, and yet he had survived out there, alone in the woods. How long had he been out there? What had happened to him? The officer, whose name tag read Carter, stepped forward with a notepad. Ms. Parker, we need to ask you a few more questions. You said you found him near Ridgewood Trail. How far off the path was he? Sarah ran a hand through her hair, still shaken. Maggie pulled me at least 50 yards off the main trail. He was curled up by a tree, barely moving. If it weren't for her, I never would have seen him. Carter nodded, jotting it down. And you didn't see anyone else? No signs of an adult or any belongings nearby? Nothing, Sarah said. Just him. And he wouldn't speak no matter what I asked. He just looked so lost. Carter exchanged a glance with the other officer, a younger man named Reynolds. We'll need to search the area thoroughly. If he was out there alone, we need to find out why. Sarah shivered despite the warmth of her house. The idea that a child had been abandoned, or worse, sent a chill down her spine. Do you think someone left him there on purpose? We can't say yet, Carter replied. But a child this young doesn't just end up in the woods without a reason. The boy stirred slightly at those words, his small fingers tightening around Maggie's fur. She let out a soft whine, pressing her nose against his cheek in reassurance. Sarah felt a lump in her throat at the sight. He felt safe with Maggie. maybe more than he did with anyone else. The paramedic finished his check and stood, turning to the officers. He's cold and dehydrated, but no serious injuries. I'd still like to get him to the hospital for a full evaluation. The boy's eyes widened in fear at the mention of the hospital, and for the first time, he reacted more than a flinch. He pulled away, shaking his head vigorously. His breathing quickened, panic flickering across his face. Hey, Sarah said quickly, stepping closer. It's okay, sweetheart. They just want to make sure you're all right. He shook his head again, clinging to Maggie like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. Sarah's chest tightened. He didn't trust the paramedics, didn't want to leave. Carter crouched down, keeping his voice calm. Buddy, we just want to help you. Can you tell us your name? Anything at all? The boy hesitated, his small mouth pressing into a tight line. His gaze flicked between the officers and Sarah, uncertainty clouding his face. Then, after what felt like forever, he whispered, Ethan. Sarah's breath caught. It was the first word he'd spoken since she found him. Ethan, she repeated gently, that's a beautiful name. Do you have a last name? Ethan bit his lip, his hands tightening into fists. For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, but then he whispered, I don't know. The officers exchanged another glance. Reynolds knelt down to Ethan's level. It's all right, buddy. We'll figure everything out. Do you know where your parents are? Ethan's eyes darkened with fear, and he shook his head violently. Pressing himself against Maggie's side, the German shepherd let out another soft whine, licking his cheek. Sarah had never seen her dog so in tune with someone's emotions before. It was like she knew exactly how to comfort him. Carter stood, his expression unreadable. We'll run his name through missing persons reports. In the meantime, I think we should take him to the hospital just to be sure he's okay. Ethan tensed, another wave of panic flashing across his face. He gripped Maggie even tighter, burying his face in her fur. Sarah's heart clenched. He was terrified of going. She took a slow breath, then looked at the officers. What if I go with him? He seems comfortable here. Maybe it would help. Carter hesitated, then nodded. That might be a good idea. If you're willing to ride along, it could make it easier for him. Sarah nodded without hesitation. Of course. Ethan didn't loosen his grip on Maggie, but his body relaxed just slightly. Sarah knelt beside him and smiled. Would it be okay if I came with you, sweetheart? You won't be alone. I promise. Ethan looked at her, searching her face. Slowly, he gave a tiny nod. Relief washed over Sarah. Okay, let's go. The officers led the way to the ambulance, and Sarah helped Ethan into the back. He refused to let go of Maggie, but she couldn't bring the dog with them in the emergency vehicle. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as they tried to separate them, his tiny hands clutching desperately at her fur. It's okay, sweetheart, Sarah said quickly, her own heart aching at his distress. Maggie will be right here when we get back. She's not going anywhere. Maggie let out a quiet huff, as if she understood, then sat obediently next to the paramedic. Sarah gave her a reassuring pat before climbing into the ambulance with Ethan. As the doors closed, she saw Maggie watching them, her ears perked as if she were standing guard. The ride to the hospital was quiet. Ethan didn't speak again, but he kept a tight grip on Sarah's hand. She held on to him just as firmly, hoping he could feel the reassurance she was trying to give him. When they arrived, the medical team took over, running tests and asking more questions Ethan wouldn't answer. He didn't fight them, but he remained silent, his expression distant. Sarah stayed by his side through it all. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an unshakable need to protect this child. Finally, after what felt like hours, the doctors confirmed he was stable, just malnourished and exhausted. The officers returned, their expressions unreadable. "We ran his name through the system," Carter said, "but there's no missing person report for an Ethan matching his description." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" Reynolds sighed. "It means either no one reported him missing, or someone doesn't want him to be found." Sarah's grip on Ethan's hand tightened. The little boy stared down at the blanket wrapped around him, his small shoulders trembling slightly. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't an accident. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter glanced at Ethan. "For now, Child Protective Services will step in. They'll try to figure out where he came from and if he has any family." Ethan's grip on Sarah's hand tightened to the point of pain. His wide, fearful eyes locked onto hers, and her heart nearly shattered. He was terrified. She took a deep breath and looked at the officers. "Is there any way he can stay with me? Just until you figure things out? He's comfortable with Maggie and me." Carter hesitated, but Reynolds spoke first. "That's up to CPS. We can put in a request, but it'll be their call." Sarah nodded. "Then I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan pressed himself against her side, his little fingers clinging to the fabric of her sleeve. She knew then, without a doubt, she wasn't letting him go without a fight. Sarah sat beside Ethan on the hospital bed, her hand resting gently on his small shoulder. The room smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, and the beeping monitors in the background made everything feel surreal. Ethan still hadn't spoken much since arriving, but he clung to Sarah like she was his only anchor in a storm. Every time a nurse or doctor entered the room, his tiny fingers dug deeper into the fabric of her sleeve, as if afraid she might disappear. Carter had stepped outside to make a call, likely to Child Protective Services. Sarah's stomach twisted at the thought. She knew they had a job to do, that they had to follow protocol, but the idea of Ethan being placed with strangers after everything he had been through made her uneasy. He needed stability, familiarity. He needed someone he trusted. And right now, that person was her. A soft knock on the door made Ethan flinch, and Sarah squeezed his hand reassuringly. A woman in her 40s, with neatly styled blonde hair and a warm but professional expression, stepped inside. She wore a crisp navy blazer and carried a clipboard. "Miss Parker?" she asked, offering a small smile. "I'm Lisa Bennett from Child Protective Services. I understand you were the one who found Ethan." Sarah nodded. "Yes. My dog, Maggie, actually found him first. He was alone in the woods." Lisa's eyes softened as she glanced at Ethan, who was doing his best to make himself small beside Sarah. "We've been briefed by the officers. Thank you for staying with him through all of this. It's clear he trusts you." Sarah glanced down at Ethan's small frame, still wrapped in the hospital blanket. "He's been through so much. He hasn't told us what happened yet, but I can tell he's scared." Lisa took a seat across from them, her tone gentle but firm. "We'll do everything we can to help him, but the first priority is ensuring his safety. That means placing him in temporary care while we investigate his situation." Ethan tensed immediately, his grip tightening around Sarah's arm. His breathing quickened, and Sarah felt his fear as if it were her own. She swallowed hard, then met Lisa's gaze. "What if he stays with me?" Lisa blinked, surprised. "You mean as a foster placement?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "I know this is sudden, but he's comfortable with me. I don't want him to be placed with strangers right now. He doesn't trust easily, and I'm afraid moving him somewhere unfamiliar will only make things worse." Lisa studied her for a moment, then glanced at Ethan. His wide eyes were locked onto Sarah, desperation clear in his expression. Finally, Lisa exhaled and gave a small nod. "I can't make that decision on my own," she admitted. "But I can put in an urgent request. Given the circumstances, it may be possible." Sarah nodded. "Please, I'll do whatever I need to. I just don't want him to be scared." Lisa gave a reassuring smile. "I can see how much you care about him. I'll start the process and see what we can do. For now, we'll need to monitor him here a bit longer, and we'll be checking in on him regularly. If we move forward with placement, there will be paperwork and home visits." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's fine, whatever it takes." Ethan didn't say a word, but the way he buried his face against her side said enough. He didn't want to be anywhere else. A few hours later, Sarah was finally allowed to take Ethan home under temporary care while CPS finalized the details. The drive back was quiet. Ethan sat in the back seat, wrapped in her spare hoodie, his small hands tucked into the sleeves. The headlights illuminated the winding road leading to her house, the familiar path bringing her some comfort. She had lived here for years, just her and Maggie. And now, unexpectedly, there was a child in her care. When she pulled into the driveway, Maggie was waiting by the front door, tail wagging wildly. As soon as Sarah unbuckled Ethan, he bolted toward the dog, wrapping his tiny arms around her neck. Maggie let out a happy chuff, licking his face eagerly. Sarah smiled. "She missed you." Ethan nodded, still clinging to the dog. He didn't speak, but the relief in his posture was obvious. Sarah took a deep breath and ushered him inside. She had spent the past few hours worrying about how he would adjust, but the moment he stepped into her house, he seemed to relax. Maggie stayed glued to his side as they moved through the living room, her big brown eyes watching over him like a guardian. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him. Ethan hesitated before giving a small nod. Sarah led him to the kitchen, where she heated up some soup and set a plate of crackers on the table. He sat across from her, Maggie curled up by his feet, watching him with quiet concern. He took small bites, his movements slow but steady. Sarah didn't push him to talk. She had a feeling he needed time, and she was willing to be patient. When he finally looked up at her, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Sarah's chest tightened. It was the first time he had spoken voluntarily since they left the hospital. She gave him a soft smile. "You're welcome, sweetheart. You're safe here." He stared at her for a moment before nodding slightly. Then he reached down and buried his fingers in Maggie's fur. Sarah watched the two of them, realizing that Maggie wasn't just comforting Ethan, he was comforting her too. As the night wore on, Sarah set up a small cot in her room, not wanting Ethan to be alone. He didn't protest when she tucked him in, but as she turned to leave, his small hand reached for hers. "Can Maggie stay?" he asked quietly. Sarah smiled. Of course. Maggie hopped onto the floor beside the cot, resting her head near Ethan's pillow. The boy curled up beside her, his breathing finally steadying. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, watching him. There were still so many questions. Where had he come from? Why had no one reported him missing? And most importantly, what was he so afraid of? She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let him face it alone. Sarah woke up to the soft patter of tiny footsteps against the hardwood floor. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then she heard the quiet creak of the door. Instinct kicked in, and she sat up quickly, her eyes adjusting to the dim morning light filtering through the curtains. Ethan was standing by the door, his small frame barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't trying to leave. He was just standing there, still as a statue, watching her as if afraid she might disappear. Maggie stirred from her spot beside him, lifting her head in quiet concern. Sarah swung her legs over the bed and kept her voice gentle. "Hey, sweetheart, did you sleep okay?" Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod, but Sarah could tell he hadn't rested well. The exhaustion was still visible in his posture, the slight slump of his shoulders, the wary look in his eyes. She knew he had been through something terrible, something that had left him afraid even in the safety of a warm house. Maggie stretched and trotted over to Sarah, then nudged Ethan with her nose as if to reassure him. The boy reached down, running his fingers through her fur. It was the first time Sarah saw something close to comfort in his expression. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's get some breakfast." She led him to the kitchen, where she started making scrambled eggs and toast. Ethan sat at the table with Maggie at his feet, watching Sarah as if studying her movements. He was quiet, but his presence no longer felt like he was bracing to run. That was something, at least. She placed a plate in front of him, along with a glass of milk. "Eat as much as you want, sweetheart." Ethan picked up his fork and took small, careful bites. He chewed slowly, as if not used to eating full meals. The thought made Sarah's heart ache. How long had he been hungry before she found him? As they ate, Sarah decided to ask gently, "Ethan, do you remember how you got to the woods?" Ethan's grip on his fork tightened. His gaze dropped to his plate, and he shook his head, his shoulders tensing. Maggie whined softly and nudged his leg. "It's okay," Sarah said quickly. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." Ethan gave a tiny nod, but his eyes stayed downcast. Whatever had happened, he wasn't ready to face it yet, and Sarah wasn't going to push him. A knock at the door made Ethan flinch. He dropped his fork and grabbed Maggie, burying his face in her fur. His whole body trembled. Sarah's chest tightened. "It's all right, sweetheart," she soothed, rubbing his back. "It's probably just the officers checking in. You're safe here. I promise." She got up and walked to the door, opening it to find Officer Carter standing on the porch. His expression was serious, but kind. "Morning, Ms. Parker. Just wanted to check in on Ethan. Mind if I come in for a moment?" Sarah stepped aside, letting him in. Carter spotted Ethan curled up against Maggie, his small fingers gripping the dog's fur like a lifeline. The officer sighed. "He still won't talk about it?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't think he's ready. He's scared. Every noise, every knock on the door, it sets him on edge." Carter nodded as he lowered himself into the chair across from Ethan. "Hey there, buddy. You doing okay?" Ethan peeked up from behind Maggie's fur, his blue eyes wary. He gave the smallest nod, but didn't say a word. Carter rubbed his jaw, glancing at Sarah. "We've been searching the area where you found him. No signs of a camp, no abandoned car, nothing to indicate how he got there. It's like he just appeared in the middle of the woods." Sarah frowned. "What about missing person reports?" Carter let out a slow breath. "Still nothing. It doesn't make sense. A child this young doesn't just go missing without someone looking for him. Either he's not in the system, or—" He trailed off, but Sarah knew what he was implying. Someone might have made sure he wasn't in the system. Ethan shifted slightly, his small fingers fidgeting with Maggie's fur. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but then he clamped his mouth shut again. Sarah's heart ached for him. Carter leaned forward. "Ethan, if you remember anything at all, you can tell us. No one is going to hurt you here. We just want to help." Ethan didn't respond, but his breathing picked up. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his back. "You don't have to talk about it now, sweetheart. Just know that we're here for you." Ethan let out a shaky breath, then buried his face against Maggie again. Sarah exchanged a look with Carter, who sighed as he stood. "I'll keep looking into it. In the meantime, Lisa from CPS told me you're officially approved for temporary placement. It's not permanent, but for now, Ethan stays with you." Relief washed over Sarah. "Thank you." Carter nodded. "I'll check in again soon. If you need anything, you call me." After he left, Sarah knelt beside Ethan. "You okay, sweetheart?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I don't want to go anywhere else." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She gave his back a gentle rub. "You're staying right here, buddy. You don't have to go anywhere." Ethan hesitated, then did something that made Sarah's heart melt. He reached out and took her hand. His tiny fingers curled around hers, holding on like he finally believed she meant it. Maggie gave a happy wag of her tail, as if approving of the silent exchange. For the first time since she found him in the woods, Sarah saw a tiny flicker of hope in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing off the breakfast dishes while Maggie lay nearby, her eyes constantly flicking toward Ethan, who sat on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. He was still quiet, but he seemed calmer now than when he first arrived. The way he had clung to her hand the night before had told her everything she needed to know. He was afraid of losing the little stability he had found. She dried her hands and walked over to the couch, sitting beside him. "Do you want to go outside for a little while? Maggie loves to run around in the yard." Ethan hesitated, then nodded slightly. Sarah took that as a good sign. Maggie perked up as soon as Sarah opened the back door, bounding outside with excitement. Ethan followed slowly, his eyes scanning the open yard as if checking for something unseen. Sarah could only imagine what was going through his mind. She knelt beside him. "It's just us here, sweetheart. You're safe." Ethan looked up at her, his blue eyes uncertain, but then Maggie trotted over with a stick in her mouth, her tail wagging. Sarah took it from her and held it out to Ethan. "You want to throw it?" He hesitated before reaching for the stick. With a little more strength than Sarah expected, he tossed it across the yard, and Maggie took off after it, kicking up the autumn leaves as she ran. For the first time, Sarah saw something close to a smile on Ethan's face. They stayed outside for a while, Maggie happily fetching the stick, while Ethan slowly warmed up to the game. Sarah watched with quiet relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Every small step felt like a victory. When they finally went back inside, Sarah made them some lunch, and Ethan ate without hesitation this time. That alone felt like progress. She was about to ask if he wanted more when there was a knock at the front door. Ethan froze, his small body going stiff. Maggie instantly went on alert, her ears perking up as she positioned herself between him and the door. Sarah quickly wiped her hands and went to check. Through the peephole, she saw Lisa Bennett from CPS. She exhaled a quiet breath of relief before opening the door. "Lisa, hi, come in." Lisa stepped inside, smiling warmly as she noticed Ethan sitting at the table. "Hello, Ethan. How are you doing today?" Ethan didn't answer, but he shifted closer to Maggie. Lisa didn't push. Instead, she turned to Sarah. "I wanted to stop by and check in. How's everything going?" Sarah glanced at Ethan, then back at Lisa. "He's adjusting, slowly. He still hasn't told me what happened, but he seems to feel safe here." Lisa nodded. "That's important. We're still searching for any family connections, but so far, nothing." It's unusual. If someone were looking for him, we should have heard something by now." Sarah frowned. "So, what happens if no one comes forward?" Lisa hesitated. "In that case, we'll have to start discussing long-term options. Right now he's in temporary placement, but if no family is found, we'll need to find a permanent solution." Sarah knew what Lisa meant. Foster care. The idea of Ethan being placed with strangers after everything made her stomach turn. "Can I keep him here?" Lisa studied her for a long moment. "Are you saying you'd be interested in long-term fostering?" Sarah looked at Ethan, who was watching her carefully, his small fingers tangled in Maggie's fur. "I just don't want him to be afraid anymore. If that means keeping him here, then yes, I'm interested." Lisa smiled. "I'll make a note of that. For now, let's keep focusing on helping him adjust. If he starts remembering anything or opens up about his past, let us know." After Lisa left, Sarah sat back down with Ethan. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "Will I have to leave?" Sarah's chest tightened. "Not if I can help it." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then finally whispered, "I don't want to go." Sarah reached over, placing a gentle hand over his. "You don't have to be scared, sweetheart. You're safe here." Ethan still looked uncertain, but he didn't pull away. That, Sarah decided, was enough for now. Later that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Sarah sat in the living room, flipping through her phone. She searched through local news articles, hoping to find anything about a missing child matching Ethan's description. But there was nothing. No recent reports, no concerned family members posting online. It was as if he had simply appeared out of nowhere. Maggie rested her head on Sarah's lap, her warm eyes filled with understanding. "I don't get it, girl," Sarah murmured, scratching behind her ears. "Why hasn't anyone reported him missing?" Maggie let out a small woof, her tail thumping against the couch. Sarah sighed, leaning back against the cushions. She needed answers, but she didn't want to push Ethan before he was ready. The next morning, Sarah decided to take Ethan into town for some fresh air. She figured a quiet trip to the park might help him feel more at ease. The town's small park had a playground, a walking trail, and plenty of open space for Maggie to run. Ethan held Sarah's hand as they walked, his grip light but steady. Maggie trotted beside them, ever watchful. When they reached the playground, Sarah knelt beside him. "Do you want to try the swings?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Sarah led him over, helping him into the seat. She gave him a gentle push, and for a moment he looked uncertain. But then, as the swing moved higher, Sarah saw something she hadn't seen before. Pure, unguarded joy. She smiled as he let out a small laugh, his eyes bright with excitement. Maggie sat beside her, watching as if pleased with the sight. After a while, Ethan climbed down from the swing and reached for Sarah's hand. "Can we go home now?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." As they walked back to the car, Sarah felt something shift. Ethan had smiled. He had laughed. He was slowly letting himself trust. And Sarah knew, more than ever, that she wasn't going to let him go. The drive home from the park was quiet, with Ethan nestled in the back seat, his head leaning against the window as he watched the trees blur past. Maggie, seated beside him, let out a content sigh, her tail giving an occasional thump against the seat. Sarah glanced at them through the rear-view mirror, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't much, but today had been a step forward. Ethan had smiled. He had laughed. That was more than she could have hoped for just days ago. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan hesitated before unbuckling his seatbelt. Sarah turned in her seat, keeping her voice light. "You okay, sweetheart?" He nodded slowly, but his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. Maggie nuzzled against him, and he reached out absent-mindedly to scratch behind her ears. Something was on his mind, but Sarah knew better than to push. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get inside. I think Maggie could use some water after all that running." Ethan slid out of the car, keeping close to Maggie's side as they walked up the porch steps. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped inside first, flipping on the lights. The house was warm and welcoming, but Ethan's eyes flicked toward the windows, his shoulders tense. Sarah knelt beside him. "You're safe here, sweetheart. No one's coming to take you away." Ethan's lips pressed together, and he looked up at her with wide, searching eyes. "Are you sure?" Sarah's heart clenched. "I promise." He hesitated for another moment before finally stepping inside. Maggie stayed glued to his side, watching him closely, as if sensing his lingering unease. Sarah walked into the kitchen, pulling out a glass of water and placing it in front of Ethan. "Why don't you sit down for a bit? I'll make us something to eat." Ethan slid into a chair at the table, his small hands wrapping around the glass. He didn't drink, just held it, as if lost in thought. Maggie lay at his feet, letting out a quiet sigh. As Sarah moved around the kitchen, she decided to try again. "Ethan, sweetheart, if you ever want to talk about anything, I'll listen, no matter what." He was silent for a long moment, then finally whispered, "I don't remember everything." Sarah stilled, turning toward him slowly. "That's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to remember everything right now." Ethan's gaze dropped to the table. "I just remember running. I was scared." Sarah set down the spoon she had been holding and sat across from him. "Do you remember where you were running from?" He shook his head. "It was dark. There were trees everywhere, and I was alone." Sarah swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do you remember how long you were out there?" Ethan shook his head again, squeezing his eyes shut. "I just remember being cold and tired." Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. "You're not alone anymore, sweetheart. You don't have to run anymore." Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything else. His small fingers gripped the glass a little tighter, his knuckles white. Sarah let him be, knowing that he needed to take this at his own pace. That night, after dinner, Sarah tucked Ethan into bed in the small cot she had set up in her room. Maggie lay beside him, her warm presence a comfort. As Sarah pulled the blanket up around him, he reached out and grabbed her hand. "Will you be here when I wake up?" he asked softly. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Always." He nodded, his grip loosening as sleep began to pull him under. Sarah sat with him for a little while, watching his chest read and fall in the steady rhythm of sleep. Maggie lifted her head slightly, her brown eyes meeting Sarah's as if to reassure her that she was standing guard. Sarah smiled and gave the dog a soft pat. "Good girl." As she climbed into her own bed, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Ethan slip through the cracks. She would fight for him, no matter what it took. And deep down, she knew Maggie would, too. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the feeling of something warm and small pressed against her side. She cracked her eyes open and saw Ethan curled up beside Maggie on the floor, his hand resting on the dog's back. Maggie lay still, her tail giving a small wag as she noticed Sarah was awake. Sarah sat up slowly, careful not to disturb him. It had been days now, and Ethan was still adjusting, but she could tell that Maggie was his biggest source of comfort. The dog had a way of making him feel safe in ways words couldn't. She slipped out of bed and into the kitchen, starting a pot of coffee. She knew today was going to be another slow process, but she was okay with that. Ethan would talk when he was ready. By the time breakfast was ready, Ethan had woken up and was sitting at the table, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Sarah set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, watching as he picked at the food before taking a few small bites. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "It's good." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. He was speaking more, even if it was just a few words. She'd take it. Maggie sat beside him, waiting patiently. Sarah handed Ethan a small piece of toast. "You can give her a little if you want." Ethan hesitated, then held the piece out to Maggie. She took it gently from his hand, chewing happily before resting her head against his lap. Ethan let out a soft giggle, the sound light and warm. Sarah smiled. "She likes you." Ethan stroked Maggie's fur, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he whispered, "I like her too." It was a small moment, but for Sarah, it meant the world. Sarah spent most of the morning tidying up the house, while Ethan sat quietly on the couch with Maggie curled beside him. She kept stealing glances his way, watching the way his small fingers ran absently through the dog's fur, the way he would occasionally glance toward the windows as if making sure nothing lurked outside. He had opened up a little more in the past day, but Sarah knew there were still shadows clinging to him, still memories that refused to surface, or worse, memories he was afraid to share. She decided not to push him. Instead, she focused on keeping things normal, keeping things steady. She figured stability was the best thing she could give him right now. "Hey, Ethan," she said, turning toward him from the kitchen. "Want to help me bake some cookies?" Ethan blinked and looked up. "Cookies?" She smiled. "Yeah, we could make some chocolate chip ones. Maggie likes to sit and watch when I bake, but I think she'd love to have a helper this time." Ethan hesitated, his gaze flicking to Maggie before he nodded slowly. "Okay." Sarah beamed. "Great! Come on, let's get started." She guided him into the kitchen, showing him how to measure the flour and sugar, how to crack the eggs carefully without getting shells in the batter. He was quiet at first, watching intently, but as they mixed everything together, she caught the smallest hint of curiosity in his eyes. Maggie sat near the counter, her ears perked up as she observed them, her tail wagging every time Ethan laughed, small, breathy chuckles that made Sarah's heart swell. They rolled the cookie dough into small balls and placed them onto the baking sheet. When Sarah put the tray in the oven, she turned back to find Ethan licking a bit of dough off his fingers. She gasped dramatically. "Oh, you stole some of the cookie dough!" Ethan's eyes went wide, and for a moment, Sarah worried she had startled him. But then, to her surprise, a tiny grin spread across his face. "Don't worry, I won't tell Maggie," she whispered, winking. Ethan giggled, hiding his face behind his hands. Sarah bit back the tears that threatened to rise. He was laughing. He was letting himself be happy, even if only for a little while. When the cookies finished baking, they sat together at the kitchen table, munching on the warm treats. Ethan's shoulders had relaxed, and for once, he wasn't looking over his shoulder or flinching at small noises. He just sat there, eating cookies, petting Maggie, being a kid. Sarah wished she could bottle up this moment and keep it safe for him forever. After lunch, Sarah decided it was time to get Ethan some more clothes. He had been living in the few things the hospital had provided, but he needed more than that. "Ethan, sweetheart, how about we go to town and pick out some clothes for you?" she asked gently. Ethan tensed slightly, his fingers curling into Maggie's fur. "Town?" Sarah nodded. "Just a quick trip. We can go together, and we'll bring Maggie with us." Ethan looked uncertain, his gaze flicking toward the door. Sarah knelt beside him. "You're safe, sweetheart. No one's going to take you away. I promise." After a long pause, he finally nodded. "Okay." Relief washed over Sarah. She helped him put on his jacket, then grabbed Maggie's leash. The drive into town was quiet, but Ethan kept glancing at her from the back seat, as if making sure she was still there. Maggie sat beside him, ever watchful. The small town's main street was lined with little shops, one of which had a modest selection of children's clothing. Sarah led Ethan inside, letting him browse. She watched as he hesitated over a soft blue sweater, his small fingers brushing over the fabric. "Do you like that one?" she asked. Ethan nodded but didn't pick it up. Sarah took it off the rack and held it up. "I think this would look great on you." Ethan's lips pressed together, as if he wasn't sure how to respond. But when Sarah placed it into the cart, he didn't object. They picked out a few more shirts, pants, and a new pair of sneakers. When they reached the register, Ethan fidgeted beside her, eyes darting toward the door. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his back. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're almost done." Ethan nodded, but stayed close to Maggie until they were back in the car. On the way home, Sarah glanced at him through the mirror. "Did you have fun today?" Ethan hesitated before giving a small nod. "Yeah," Sarah smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. That night, after he had changed into one of his new shirts, Ethan curled up in bed with Maggie at his side. Sarah sat on the edge of the cot, brushing a few strands of hair from his forehead. "Thank you for today," Ethan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's chest tightened. "Anytime, sweetheart. Sleep well." As she turned off the light and settled into her own bed, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she truly believed that they were heading toward something better. And as long as Ethan had Maggie by his side, she knew he would never have to face it alone. The next morning, Sarah decided to take Ethan to a small farmer's market on the outskirts of town. She figured it would be a gentle way for him to be around more people without overwhelming him. Maggie, of course, would be right there with them. Ethan was hesitant at first, gripping Maggie's leash tightly as they walked past the vendor stalls. Sarah made sure to keep things light, letting him set the pace. They stopped at a stand selling fresh honey, and Ethan watched curiously as the vendor poured golden liquid into a jar. "Would you like to try some?" Sarah asked. Ethan hesitated before nodding. The vendor handed him a small sample on a wooden spoon, and Ethan took a cautious taste. His eyes widened slightly. "It's sweet," Sarah smiled. "It is. Do you like it?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah." She bought a jar, and they continued browsing. A woman selling homemade knit scarves gave Ethan a kind smile. "That dog of yours is a real beauty." Ethan looked up at Maggie, then down at the scarves. He reached out hesitantly and brushed his fingers over one made of soft blue yarn. Sarah noticed. "Would you like one?" Ethan hesitated before whispering, "Maybe." Sarah handed the woman some cash and draped the scarf around Ethan's shoulders. It was a small thing, but the way he clutched it made her heart ache. Another piece of comfort. Another step forward. As they walked back to the car, Sarah glanced at Ethan. "Did you like the market?" Ethan nodded. Can we come again? As they sat near the water, Sarah pulled out the snacks she had packed. She handed Ethan a small granola bar, which he took with a quiet, "Thank you." After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "I like it here." Sarah looked at him. "Yeah?" Ethan nodded. "It's quiet." Sarah exhaled softly. "Sometimes quiet is nice, isn't it?" Ethan nodded again, staring out at the lake. After a few moments, he spoke in a voice so soft Sarah almost didn't hear him. "I think I was in a place that wasn't quiet before." Sarah's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Do you remember what it was like?" Ethan shook his head. "Not really. Just, it wasn't quiet. And I didn't like it." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his back. "Well, you don't have to go back to that place, sweetheart. You're safe now." Ethan didn't respond, but he leaned into her slightly. That was enough for now. They stayed by the lake for a while longer, watching Maggie chase the ripples in the water. When the sun started dipping lower in the sky, Sarah decided it was time to head back home. On the drive back, Ethan spoke again. "Can we come here again?" Sarah glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Anytime." That night, after dinner, Sarah found Ethan sitting in the living room with Maggie curled beside him. He had the soft blue blanket wrapped around his shoulders and was staring at the book they had read the night before. Sarah sat beside him. "Do you want me to read it again?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." She opened the book and started reading. As she read, she felt Ethan shift closer, resting his head lightly against her arm. Maggie gave a soft sigh, settling in beside them. For the first time since she had found him, Sarah felt something deep in her heart shift. Ethan was still healing, still carrying the weight of something unknown. But for now, he was safe. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, Ethan surprised Sarah by waking up before she did. When she walked into the kitchen, she found him sitting at the table, already dressed, his small hands wrapped around a mug of warm cocoa. "Morning, sweetheart," she said with a smile. "You're up early," Ethan shrugged. "Didn't feel like sleeping more." Sarah sat down across from him. "Well, I was thinking of running a few errands today. Do you want to come with me?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Okay." Sarah took him into town, stopping by the grocery store and a few small shops. She let him pick out a few snacks and even helped him choose a small stuffed dog that reminded him of Maggie. When they returned home, Sarah noticed something had changed. Ethan was talking more. Small things, but they mattered. He asked about what she was cooking, commented on the weather, even asked if Maggie could have a treat. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Ethan turned to her. I think I like it here." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'm so glad, sweetheart." He gave a small smile before leaning into her side. Maggie curled up beside them, content. For the first time, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, Ethan was beginning to believe he had found a home. Sarah woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. It was a gentle drizzle, just enough to make the morning feel cozy. She turned over and saw Ethan still sleeping soundly in his cot, Maggie curled up beside him. The soft blue blanket was pulled up to his chin, and his small hand rested lightly on Maggie's fur. She let them sleep a little longer while she started breakfast, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the house. As she flipped pancakes, she heard the quiet creak of the floorboards, She turned to see Ethan rubbing his eyes, Maggie at his side. "Morning, sweetheart," Sarah said with a smile. "Did you sleep okay?" Ethan nodded. "Maggie stayed with me." Sarah chuckled. "She's a good girl, isn't she?" Ethan patted Maggie's head. "The best." Sarah placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. "I was thinking since it's raining, maybe we could do something fun inside today." Ethan looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Like what?" "Well," Sarah said, "I have a big box of art supplies. We could draw, maybe even paint something." Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay." After breakfast, Sarah set up a small table in the living room, covering it with paper, markers, colored pencils, and paints. Ethan sat across from her, holding a blue marker but not drawing anything yet. Maggie lay beside him, her tail thumping softly. "You can draw anything you want," Sarah encouraged. "Maybe the lake we went to?" Ethan thought for a moment, then started sketching slow, careful lines. Sarah worked on her own drawing, sneaking glances at him every now and then. After a while, he spoke. "I think I had a dog before." Sarah set down her pencil. "You do?" Sarah smiled. "Of course." It was small moments like these that told her they were on the right path. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps moving hesitantly across the floor. She blinked her eyes open and turned to see Ethan standing near the bedroom door, holding on to Maggie's fur. He wasn't panicked or trembling like before, but there was a lingering uncertainty in his posture. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, sitting up. "Did you sleep okay?" Ethan nodded, though she wasn't sure if he really had. Maggie gave a low wag of her tail and nudged Ethan's hand, encouraging him to step forward. He did, just a little, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Sarah reached out her hand, waiting to see if he'd take it. After a long pause, he did. "Are you hungry? We can make pancakes." Ethan hesitated before nodding again. It was still a challenge for him to put words to what he wanted, but Sarah was starting to understand his silent language. She led him to the kitchen, and as she started gathering ingredients, she noticed the way Ethan kept glancing at her, as if trying to memorize every movement she made. He had done the same thing the day before when they baked cookies. There was something careful and calculating in his expression, not in a fearful way, but in a way that suggested he was learning what normal was supposed to look like. "Do you want to help stir the batter?" Sarah asked, offering him the whisk. Ethan hesitated before taking it, holding it gingerly as though he was afraid of doing something wrong. Sarah guided his hands, showing him how to mix, and after a few moments, he got the hang of it. A tiny flicker of pride crossed his face, and Sarah felt a warm tug in her chest. By the time breakfast was ready, Ethan had managed to crack an egg all by himself. Only a little bit of shell had fallen in, but he'd laughed when Sarah fished it out. It was a small victory, but an important one. As they sat at the table eating, Sarah noticed Ethan looking out the window more than usual. His fingers traced the rim of his plate, and his brows knitted together slightly. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated before murmuring, "Do you think someone's looking for me?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was the first time he had brought up the possibility of a past he didn't remember, or maybe a past he was too afraid to talk about. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "But I do know that we're trying to find out. The officers and Ms. Lisa are working hard to see if there's anyone out there who knows you." Ethan swallowed, staring down at his hands. What if I don't want them to find me?" Sarah's chest tightened. "Do you remember something?" He shook his head quickly. No, not really, just, I don't know. I feel like maybe I shouldn't want to go back. Sarah's heart ached. Well, no one is going to make you do anything you don't want to do. You're safe here. Ethan glanced at her, searching her face for something. After a long moment, he nodded. Then, as if deciding the conversation was over, he returned to eating his pancakes in silence. Sarah let the subject drop, but the weight of his words lingered in her mind. He didn't remember what had happened, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. After breakfast, Sarah decided they needed some fresh air. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind that made the leaves crunch underfoot and the air smell like wood smoke from distant fireplaces. She took Ethan and Maggie for a walk along the trail behind her house, letting Ethan set the pace. He stayed close to her, occasionally reaching down to grab Maggie's leash, even though Sarah already had a firm grip on it. He liked holding on to something, grounding himself in small ways. Sarah didn't mind. At one point, he suddenly stopped walking and looked up at her. Can we go back to the park? Sarah was surprised. Of course, sweetheart. Do you want to go now? Ethan nodded. Maggie liked it there. Sarah smiled. I think she did too. They turned around and drove into town, heading toward the small park where Ethan had first laughed on the swings. As soon as they arrived, Maggie wagged her tail excitedly, pulling slightly on her leash, as if remembering the fun they had last time. Ethan's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles as he watched her. Do you want to swing again? Sarah asked. Ethan thought for a moment before shaking his head. Can we sit on the bench? Sarah nodded and led him to a wooden bench near the playground. He climbed up onto the seat, his feet dangling, and Maggie sat right beside him, resting her head on his lap. Ethan's small fingers stroked her ears absent-mindedly as he watched the children playing nearby. For a long time, he didn't speak, and Sarah didn't push him. She simply sat beside him, watching the same things he watched, giving him space to process whatever was going through his young mind. After a while, he finally spoke. I think I was running away from someone. Sarah's breath hitched, but she kept her voice calm. Do you remember who? Ethan shook his head. No, just that I had to run. I was scared. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his back. It's okay. You don't have to remember everything right now. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly in Maggie's fur. What if I don't want to remember? Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. Then you don't have to. Not until you're ready. Ethan looked up at her, his blue eyes uncertain. Will you still let me stay, even if I don't remember? Sarah felt her heart break. Oh, sweetheart, of course I will. He studied her for a long moment before finally leaning into her side. Maggie let out a quiet huff, as if approving of the moment, and Sarah wrapped an arm around Ethan's small shoulders. They sat there like that for a while, the cool breeze rustling the leaves, the sounds of laughter from the playground filling the air. For the first time since she had found Ethan in the woods, Sarah felt something shift. He was still afraid. He was still uncertain. But he was starting to trust. And that was everything. Later that evening, after they had returned home, Sarah made some hot cocoa while Ethan and Maggie sat curled up on the couch. Ethan had chosen a soft blue blanket to wrap himself in, the same color as the scarf Sarah had bought for him at the market. He looked small, but for the first time, he also looked at peace. When Sarah handed him a mug, he hesitated before speaking. Can we read a story tonight? Sarah smiled, her heart swelling. Of course, sweetheart. They spent the rest of the night reading, Maggie nestled between them. It was another small step, but one Sarah would cherish. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Maggie's paws padding softly across the wooden floor. She blinked her eyes open, feeling the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the curtains. When she turned her head, she saw Ethan still curled up on the cot beside her bed, his small body wrapped in the soft blue blanket he had grown attached to. Maggie was resting beside him, watching him as if making sure he was okay. Sarah smiled to herself. She had never seen Maggie so protective of anyone before. The bond between the boy and the dog was something unspoken, but undeniable. She got up quietly, stretching before heading to the kitchen to start breakfast. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, she heard the soft shuffling of feet. A few moments later, Ethan appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning, sweetheart," Sarah greeted, keeping her voice light. "You hungry?" Ethan nodded, stepping further into the kitchen. Maggie followed close behind, her tail wagging lazily. Sarah motioned to the chair. "Go ahead and sit. Breakfast will be ready soon." Ethan climbed onto the chair, watching her move around the kitchen. He seemed more comfortable today, more at ease. Sarah took that as a good sign. As she plated the food, she decided to test the waters. "Ethan, sweetheart, do you want to do something fun today?" Ethan looked up from his plate, curiosity flickering across his face. "Like what?" "Well," Sarah said, setting his plate in front of him, "I thought maybe we could take Maggie to the lake. There's a little trail, and she loves to splash in the water." Ethan hesitated, his fork frozen in midair. Sarah gave him time to process the idea before adding, "We don't have to if you don't want to." After a moment, Ethan nodded slowly. "Okay." Sarah smiled. "Okay." After breakfast, Sarah packed a small bag with snacks and water. Ethan helped her attach Maggie's leash, and they piled into the car. The drive to the lake was peaceful, with the winding road lined by tall trees that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. When they arrived, Ethan hesitated before stepping out of the car. His small fingers clutched the hem of his sweater as his eyes scanned the area. Sarah noticed his hesitation and knelt beside him. "It's just us, sweetheart. No one else is here." Ethan nodded, but didn't move until Maggie gave his hand a reassuring nudge. Slowly, he let go of his sweater and took a small step forward. They walked along the narrow trail, the sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet. Maggie trotted ahead, her ears perked with excitement. When they reached the edge of the lake, she let out an excited bark before wading into the shallow water. Ethan let out a small giggle, covering his mouth as if surprised by the sound. Sarah smiled at him. "She loves the water." Ethan nodded, his eyes following Maggie as she splashed around. After a few moments, he stepped closer to the edge, kneeling down to dip his fingers into the cool water. Sarah watched as his expression softened. He seemed more relaxed here, surrounded by nature, away from the worries that had been weighing him down. As they sat near the water, Sarah pulled out the snacks she had packed. She handed Ethan a small granola bar, which he took with a quiet, "Thank you." After a while, Ethan broke the silence. "I like it here." Sarah looked at him. "Yeah?" Ethan nodded. "It's quiet." Sarah exhaled softly. "Sometimes quiet is nice, isn't it?" Ethan nodded again, staring out at the lake. After a few moments, he spoke in a voice so soft Sarah almost didn't hear him. "I think I was in a place that wasn't quiet before." Sarah's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. Do you remember what it was like? Ethan shook his head. Not really. Just, it wasn't quiet. And I didn't like it. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his back. Well, you don't have to go back to that place, sweetheart. You're safe now. Ethan didn't respond, but he leaned into her slightly. That was enough for now. They stayed by the lake for a while longer, watching Maggie chase the ripples in the water. When the sun started dipping lower in the sky, Sarah decided it was time to head back home. On the drive back, Ethan spoke again. Can we come here again? Sarah glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smiled. Of course, sweetheart. Anytime. That night, after dinner, Sarah found Ethan sitting in the living room with Maggie curled beside him. He had the soft blue blanket wrapped around his shoulders and was staring at the book they had read the night before. Sarah sat beside him. Do you want me to read it again? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Okay. She opened the book and started reading. As she read, she felt Ethan shift closer, resting his head lightly against her arm. Maggie gave a soft sigh, settling in beside them. For the first time since she had found him, Sarah felt something deep in her heart shift. Ethan was still healing, still carrying the weight of something unknown. But for now, he was safe. And that was all that mattered. The next morning, Ethan surprised Sarah by waking up before she did. When she walked into the kitchen, she found him sitting at the table, already dressed, his small hands wrapped around a mug of warm cocoa. Morning, sweetheart, she said with a smile. You're up early, Ethan shrugged. Didn't feel like sleeping more. Sarah sat down across from him. Well, I was thinking of running a few errands today. Do you want to come with me? Ethan hesitated before nodding. Okay. Sarah took him into town, stopping by the grocery store and a few small shops. She let him pick out a few snacks and even helped him choose a small stuffed dog that reminded him of Maggie. When they returned home, Sarah noticed something had changed. Ethan was talking more. Small things, but they mattered. He asked about what she was cooking, commented on the weather, even asked if Maggie could have a treat. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Ethan turned to her. I think I like it here. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. I'm so glad, sweetheart. He gave a small smile before leaning into her side. Maggie curled up beside them, content. For the first time, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, Ethan was beginning to believe he had found a home. Sarah woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. It was a gentle drizzle, just enough to make the morning feel cozy. She turned over and saw Ethan still sleeping soundly in his cot, Maggie curled up beside him. The soft blue blanket was pulled up to his chin, and his small hand rested lightly on Maggie's fur. She let them sleep a little longer while she started breakfast, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the house. As she flipped pancakes, she heard the quiet creak of the floorboards. She turned to see Ethan rubbing his eyes, Maggie at his side. Morning, sweetheart, Sarah said with a smile. Did you sleep okay? Ethan nodded. Maggie stayed with me. Sarah chuckled. She's a good girl, isn't she? Ethan patted Maggie's head. The best. Sarah placed a plate of pancakes in front of him. I was thinking since it's raining, maybe we could do something fun inside today. Ethan looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Like what? Well, Sarah said, I have a big box of art supplies. We could draw, maybe even paint something. Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding. Okay? After breakfast, Sarah set up a small table in the living room, covering it with paper, markers, colored pencils, and paints. Ethan sat across from her, holding a blue marker but not drawing anything yet. Maggie lay beside him, her tail thumping softly. You can draw anything you want, Sarah encouraged. Maybe the lake we went to? Ethan thought for a moment, then started sketching slow, careful lines. Sarah worked on her own drawing, sneaking glances at him every now and then. After a while, he spoke. I think I had a dog before. Sarah set down her pencil. You do? Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening around the marker. I don't remember what he looked like, but I think I had one. Sarah kept her voice calm. That's a really good memory to have, sweetheart. Ethan stared at his drawing. I don't know what happened to him. Sarah's heart ached. Maybe one day, you'll remember more. And if you do, we'll figure it out together. Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything else. He picked up a brown pencil and began shading in a small shape next to his lake drawing. For the rest of the morning, they colored in silence, but Sarah knew this was a step forward. By the afternoon, the rain had stopped, and Ethan helped Sarah dry off Maggie with an old towel before heading outside for a short walk. The air smelled fresh, and the world looked like it had been washed clean. Ethan stayed close to Sarah, occasionally reaching out to hold Maggie's leash. As they walked through the quiet neighborhood, Ethan looked up. Sarah? She turned to him. Yes, sweetheart? Ethan hesitated, then asked, Do you think I'll ever remember everything? Sarah took a deep breath. I don't know, sweetheart. But no matter what, you don't have to do it alone. Ethan nodded slowly, seeming to take comfort in her words. He reached down, gripping Maggie's fur gently. I think Maggie helps me feel safe. Sarah smiled. I think so too. They continued their walk, the sound of wet leaves crunching underfoot. It wasn't a big moment, but to Sarah, it meant everything. Ethan was healing, little by little, and she would be there for him every step of the way. Later that afternoon, as they returned to the house, Sarah noticed Ethan growing quieter. He held on to Maggie's leash a little tighter, his steps slowing down. She didn't want to push him, but she also knew when something was weighing on him. Ethan, sweetheart, is something on your mind? He hesitated before answering. I had a dream. Sarah's stomach tightened slightly. A dream? Ethan nodded. It was dark, and I was running. I think someone was calling my name, but I didn't want to stop. Sarah crouched down in front of him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Do you think it was a memory? Ethan bit his lip. Maybe, but I don't remember what happened after that. Sarah gave him a small, reassuring smile. It's okay. Memories can come back in pieces. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Ethan nodded, though he still looked unsure. Maggie nudged his hand with her nose, as if sensing his unease, and he immediately wrapped his arms around her neck. That evening, Sarah decided to take his mind off things by making his favorite meal, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. As they ate, Ethan seemed to relax again, the warmth of the meal and Maggie's presence calming him. After dinner, they curled up by the fireplace, Maggie lying across both their laps. Sarah read from one of Ethan's favorite books, her voice soft and steady. Halfway through, Ethan leaned his head against her shoulder. Sarah? He murmured sleepily. Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for finding me. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat and kissed the top of his head. You're welcome, sweetheart. I'm so glad Maggie did. Ethan gave a small, sleepy nod, his fingers tangled in Maggie's fur. Within minutes, he was asleep, his breathing slow and even. Sarah let out a deep breath, running her fingers through his soft hair. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. Ethan was exactly where he was meant to be. Safe. Loved. Home. The next few days passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. Ethan was talking more, asking small questions about the house, the town, and Maggie. He no longer hesitated before reaching for Sarah's hand when they went for walks, and he no longer flinched at unexpected noises. The progress was slow, but it was there, and Sarah held on to every bit of it. One morning, as Sarah was sipping her coffee, she heard Ethan in the other room, talking softly to Maggie. She set her cup down and listened. "I think I had a dog like you," he murmured. "I don't remember his name. I don't remember anything, really. But I think he was nice." Maggie let out a low, contented hum, pressing her nose into Ethan's lap. He giggled, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. He was remembering more, little by little. Later that day, Lisa from CPS stopped by for one of her regular visits. She smiled as she watched Ethan feed Maggie a treat, his small hands steady and sure. "He looks happy here," Lisa commented. Sarah nodded. "He is. And he's remembering things, just small pieces. He mentioned having a dog before." Lisa sighed. "We still don't have any leads. No missing person reports that match. It's strange." Sarah felt the familiar weight of frustration. How could a little boy just disappear, with no one looking for him? And if someone had left him in those woods on purpose, why? Ethan wandered over, Maggie at his heels. "Can Maggie and I go outside?" Sarah smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." Ethan beamed, opening the door and running outside with Maggie. Lisa watched him go, a thoughtful look on her face. "You know, Sarah, if no one comes forward, we'll have to start looking at permanent placement options." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" Lisa studied her. "It means if you're willing, we could begin the adoption process." Sarah inhaled sharply. She had known this might come, had even thought about it in the quiet moments before falling asleep. But hearing it out loud made it real. She looked outside, watching Ethan chase Maggie through the fallen leaves, his laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. "I don't want him to go anywhere else," Sarah admitted. "This is his home." Lisa nodded, her smile soft. "Then let's start making it official." The process took weeks, but each step felt like another brick in the foundation of the home they were building together. Ethan didn't fully understand at first, but when Sarah explained it in simple terms, told him he would never have to leave, his face lit up in a way that made her eyes burn with tears. "Really?" he asked, his voice small, hopeful. "Really?" Sarah whispered, pulling him into a hug. Maggie barked beside them as if she too was celebrating. On the day it became final, Ethan clutched Sarah's hand as they walked out of the courthouse, his new last name legally hers. The cold air bit at their cheeks, but Sarah had never felt warmer in her entire life. Ethan looked up at her. "So, I really get to stay?" Sarah knelt down, cupping his face in her hands. "Forever, sweetheart." He threw his arms around her, squeezing tightly. "I love you, Sarah." Sarah's throat tightened as she hugged him back. "I love you too, Ethan." Maggie barked again, wagging her tail wildly, and Ethan laughed. "And I love Maggie," Sarah chuckled. "I think she loves you most of all." As they walked to the car, Ethan slipped his small hand into hers. The weight of uncertainty that had once hung over him was gone. He had a home. He had a family. he had love. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't lost anymore. He was found.